Thank you very much for these four very, very fascinating presentations. We already have a couple of questions, and I would ask the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the chat so that we can go through them to the extent that we have time. Let's see how far we get. So the first question is by Saqib Qureshi to John Tolan. And I think it's a very important question. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I'm curious how you navigate the politics of engaging in scholarship on this topic. For instance, I can see Muslim extremists as using these depictions to say, look how they're ridiculous. And those on the opposite side, the far right, using this for satire and possibly reviving such caricatures. How do you prevent your scholarship from being possibly appropriated by such groups?
That's a very good question. Of course, it's something we've discussed among us, the four of us, and try to find ways to counter. One can't control those kinds of reactions, of course. I find that for example, my Muhammad book was, I mean, what I gave today were some quite negative, obviously, perceptions of Islam. There are others in my book I mix. I mean, some of, when you get into the later period, particularly Enlightenment, you have many extremely positive portrayals of the Prophet and the Quran. So when I've been invited, particularly when my book came out in French, to a number of Muslim associations, to radio stations and media that cater to Muslims and Arabic-speaking populations in France, and there was a lot of interest and fascination with these stories. And I mean, one of the things that I try to do, and that we try to do in this project, is show to what extent Islam forms part of European culture. Sometimes that's been rejection, of course, and polemics, but not always. So I haven't had that much pushback from Muslims, certainly from Muslim extremists. What I have had occasionally is the far right in France, in particular when our funding was announced for this program, major grant from the European Union to study the place of the Quran in European culture. There were some right-wing groups in France that attacked me. Look at what Europe is spending money on promoting Islam, and what's more, giving this money to an American who should go back across the Atlantic and not be bothering us here in France. So you can never completely avoid it, but as we've sometimes said between us, when the people like that are attacking you, you're probably doing something right.
Thank you. Another question from Shaun Marmon. What was the extent of the circulation of Iberian translations in Europe? Did European polemicists and scholars make use of the Iberian scholars' broader knowledge of tafsir and sunnah? I don't know whether Mercedes wants to take this or whoever else wants to take the question.
I've said something about it. Part of it goes to Italy, and through Italy to Europe. But there are examples, well, and you have to remember that Robert of Keaton wrote his translation in Spain, and edited by Bibliander became the main text on the Quran all over Europe. So it did. But I think the success of Juan Andrés, that is quoted even in the preface of the George Sale Quran, and I don't know who has shown it. I think John. So Juan Andrés becomes an authority in things Islamic all over the place, but mostly through other countries. Spain and its scientific knowledge gets somehow isolated because of many things who have to do with counter-reformation, Protestantism, accusations of absolutism and Inquisition and so forth. So things coming from Spain tend to be suspicious. Sorry, that's it. I don't know if someone else wants to say something.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else wants to comment on this? If not, I go to the next question. One question also for Mercedes. Do we know anything about the Vorlage for the Quranic text in Arabic copied and or used in Spain? And that's a question from Michael Mutreich.
I don't understand the question very well. Maybe because I don't know what Vorlage means. If that's the
anti-script.
word he has used.
Antigraph.
Sorry?
Antigraph. I mean, the copy you use to make your own copy from.
Yeah. So that, how does it circulate?
Yeah, I mean, what were the copies that were used for the Quranic text in Arabic that were copied and used in Spain? But
that's another part, that's another line of research we are following. We are doing it right now, but many of it comes from Al-Andalus, and it comes from Al-Andalus because of the writing, because of the division in 4 parts of the Quran, because of the numbering of the surahs, because of the marking at the beginning of each surah in the manuscript. We have people working on that, but there is a continuity with Al-Andalus.
Okay, thank you. One question for Jan Lob from Andrea Selli. Thank you to all the panelists for the excellent presentation. A question for Jan. I was wondering if in his Protestant sources, he also noticed positive appropriations of themes and stories from the Quran.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea, for the question. Yes, 2 things. I mean, appropriation, I don't know appropriation, whether this is, but I mean, one thing that these polemicists in the 16th century always stress is the danger that the Quran presents, because it is flattering in many passages, because it has like kind of flattering concepts of Christ, Maria, Moses, and because people could be deceived that this is actually not such a bad thing, right? So that's very often the kind of the start of and I do think there's something. I mean, it's not just a rhetorical device. I could imagine that. I mean, it was also we often read that people should not think that they could just convert to Islam and would still be saved and could keep like the kind of Christian. So this kind of Nicodemism that we, so this problem of Nicodemism that happens to slaves quite often, or to people who return, who then say in front of the Inquisition, we converted to Islam outwardly, but in our heart we still were stay Christians. So the apparent proximity of Islam to Christianity is often and is often mentioned, and so on. There are these positive mentionings of Christ and so on and so forth in the Quran. That up. Another thing which I think is very important, or is something that interests me very much, is obviously the fascination, but that happens in the late 17th and 18th century for the say aesthetical value of the Quran, right? That it's something that that happens. I mean, not just in Protestant, but there is kind of a Protestant line of interest in all Arabic poetry, and also in the aesthetics of the Quran that leads then to also to Nachdichtungen, so kind of literature, romantic literature, particularly in Germany, kind of influenced by sometimes even by the Quran.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I have an interesting question from Cesar Julio. It's in Arabic, but I translate it into English so that everyone can understand it. Does any one of you study the relation between the scholars, the Muslim scholars in European countries and the Muslim scholars in the countries of Islam with regard to Quranic studies? I don't know who wants to take this, but I think it's a very interesting question.
Roberto, I mean,
And if you want to go.
Well, I mean, I was just about to say that. I mean, obviously, if I understand the question correctly, is obviously I guess the influence of tafsir that you mentioned, right? And that is, of course, although I argue that you know, we have kind of with my authors in Protestant Europe, you've kind of often a reduced view. There is obviously a tradition that works quite particularly in the 18th century that uses, or in the late 17th century, that uses tafsir and profits from Islamic scholarship that is transmitted to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess maybe the question is also more related to.
Yeah, if I can add something in relation to the work I also try to explain and carrying out. There were problems because the approach was to tafsir, no, and commentary was the direct key to knowledge. But as far as I could check, I mean, there were in Europe there was very few items of para-Quranic sciences literature. For instance, all the treatises about verse numbering and also the science in relation to the Quran. And also circulation of Sunnah works was reduced. It was rather problematic. Things start to change when the amount of Islamic manuscripts suddenly increased in the second half of the 17th century. You have studies about this, and I mean, they had to face problems in evaluating the material they had, and also with the work of Derbelot, they had a larger perception of the Muslim library. So it's clear in the first steps that it's very difficult to talk about something like I mean, a learned relation between the Islamic literature as a whole. It was not clear. For instance, Mercedes mentioned the manuscripts brought by Cardinal Camillo Massimo to Rome from Spain. These were the main manuscripts Marracci used to work. It was a collection of 21 manuscripts, and this was his personal large library of Islamic literature, which could not include everything. And he organized to have other things copied by other libraries in Rome. It was not easy to access them, and so on. So, I mean, something like the perception of the relation between European scholars and the whole of the image of Islamic library we have today was something different. This is also very well seen in the use of Ibn Abi Zamanin's tafsir, which comes from the Spain relevance of this, the circulation of this tafsir in Spain, comes to the rest of Europe because it was a handy small commentary before the Jalalain, and then was sometimes substituted by Jalalain because also the major tafsir was in many volumes, and it was not easy to have a whole copy of not Tabari, which was not so much circulating, but also the other tafsir.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Perhaps one last question from Valentina Sagari-Rossi. Are there any linguistic connections between the first Quran translations, Arabic into Latin, with the first vocabularies, Arabic, Latin, in the very early 17th century?
Yeah, I can give at least a beginning to that, because the first vocabularies that I know of from Arabic to Latin are actually the 13th century. And they're in Dominican, they seem to be copied in a Dominican milieu of missionaries. And so it's less, I'm not aware of Quranic vocabulary per se so much as On the contrary, Christian vocabulary that's translated from Latin into Arabic. There's, for example, things on persons and hypostases and so forth, so that these Christian missionaries can preach and explain Christianity to Muslims in Arabic.
I do think that the Raphaelengius dictionary, the first printed Arabic Latin dictionary that I mentioned, was very much a classical Arab. So that's why it was of no use for anybody who traveled in the Near East, right? So all the merchants like to stick. So I don't know exactly how much Quranic vocabulary was in there, but what we certainly also have is all these people, or most of these scholars I mentioned. We found in their archives word lists they made for themselves, and there are many word. So with their focus on, as I think, like their focus on the Quran as the prime text to learn Arabic, there's also many word lists of Arabic of Quranic terminology that we can find in Stuttgart or in Rostock. So which sometimes correspond to these annotated copies that we see here.
Thank you very much. We still have a number of questions, but I think, unfortunately, we have to come to an end at this point. And let me thank again our 4 speakers of today for having been with us today and for having shared some of their work with us. And we really look forward to the ongoing results of your research. And thank you also for the entire audience for having joined us today. And please stay tuned for any of the upcoming Near Eastern Studies events here at the Institute for Advanced Study over the course of this academic year. And the next is actually taking place in a week from now on Syriac culture and the reception of the Bible in Syriac. And all other events are listed on the website of Near Eastern Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study. So goodbye, and I hope you will join us again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine.
Thank you, Sabine. Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks.
We only regret not to be there in Princeton, actually.
Yeah, really,